Welcome to another FFRF's Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live. This is where we answer common questions about atheism, freethinkers, state-church separation, and today about the Bible. I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show.
And I'm Amit Pal, the Director of Communications at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We work to keep state and church separate and to educate the public about the views of non-theists.
We're often told that God is good, but is that true? Today we're going to challenge that notion, and we're going to talk about the unpleasant God of the Bible. If you have any questions, you can ask them right here on Facebook, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
And who better to talk about this than you? Because you have an entire book on the subject, which is called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. And this came out 2 years ago, and it was your 8th book. You have had a book or two since. And tell us, Dan, about the book and how it was inspired.
Inspired? That's a good word.
Exactly. Even free thinkers can be inspired.
Yeah, we
in
can be
different ways, though.
inspired. Well, you know, the book started in 2014. Richard Dawkins had written a book, The God Delusion, you know, his famous blockbuster in 2006. And there is a sentence in The God Delusion for which Richard Dawkins says he has been the most criticized, and he is a sentence about the God of the Bible. Let me read you that sentence that he wrote.
Certainly.
He says, in the God Delusion, chapter 2, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Wow, that's quite a mouthful, Dan. But then you added to that.
Well, yeah, so what happened was Richard Dawkins emailed me and said, help, I've been attacked by this. The chief rabbi of London called him anti-Semitic, you know, for saying that. Yeah. But to his credit, he later backed off and he says, well, you're attacking the character, not the Jews themselves, you know. And so Richard knows that I used to be a preacher and that I'd been a Bible student and all that. So he asked me if I could help him. He was making a PowerPoint, keynote presentation. He and I use Macs, you know. It's kind of like Macs, Keynote and PowerPoint are like Protestants and Catholics, you know, we have different schools. He was going to make this slide that he called the spider diagram, where he had his sentence and then 19 spider legs would go out with each of those 19 nasty descriptors, and he wanted to be able to click on like ethnic cleansing and up would pop a verse to demonstrate it. And I said, well, sure, I'll do that. And then after a while, it became more than 1,000 and then more than 1,500 verses, way too many for a slide. Yeah. And Richard said, you know what? This would make a good book. And I thought, yeah, good book, pun intended. Good.
And in other words, Richard Dawkins gave his blessing, Dan.
I suppose so, blessing from the non-pope.
Totally.
Wanting a good book.
Yeah.
And so the book is called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. And so as I was doing the research, I documented each of those 19, and that's part 1 of the book. It's called Dawkins Was Right. However, I discovered that there were more than 19, and so part 2 of the book is called Dawkins Was Too Kind, and I added 8 more, you know, pyromaniacal and angry and so on. Since that time, I have added 3 more. So let's look at some of those. For example, if we wanted to click on ethnic cleanser, for example, you will find a verse like this. You shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land, for I have given you the land to possess. There's another verse in there that says, go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. That's in 1 Samuel. There's a whole lot more verses where God of the Bible is commanding, committing, or condoning total genocide of a whole group of people, because he had promised his lover, the Israelites, that he called them a wife, and he was their husband, this little love nest where they could live with him forever and not be threatened by other religions. And so they had to go in and totally wipe out all the Canaanites. Another example is genocidal. One of the words that Dawkins used, a verse in Deuteronomy that says, "You must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them." Another verse in Deuteronomy says, and they obeyed orders, "And the Lord our God delivered him before us. And we took all the cities at that time and utterly destroyed the men and the women and the little ones of every city, and we left none to remain." So there's all these examples of total genocide, wiping out a whole group of people because they were the wrong religion. And of course the flood, Noah's flood, was the biggest example of genocide. And who knows how many people, if the story were true, it's not a true story, but if the story were true, that would have happened at a time on our planet when there were roughly 20 million people. And so think of that. One flood killed 20 million people, men, women, children, pregnant women, which is basically a kind of aborticide, and even the cats and the butterflies and every living thing. It says every living thing. So the God of the Bible is definitely genocidal. How do you square genocide with God is love?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Shall we just keep going through and then...
No, I mean, or we can intersperse our discussion with examples.
Yeah.
And just as a preface, Dan, to our discussion of your book and your critique, I mean, it's very impressive that the book came about due to Dawkins' suggestion, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers would love to bring to fruition the way you did a book, that was inspired, again in quotation marks, by Richard Dawkins.
Well,
so that's great.
It was a bit of an accident, and it was really kind of his idea that each of those would become a chapter.
Sure.
So in my book, each chapter, I don't just spit out the verses. I talk about the background, the context, what was happening, what were some of the Hebrew words, what do they actually mean, and so on. Let's look at another one. God is unjust. And one example of unjust is that he promised to punish the children and grandchildren for the sins of the grandparents. In Deuteronomy 5, we see, "I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the iniquity of the parents, to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me." That's in Deuteronomy. So...
Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff, it seems.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course not. Yeah, I mean, that collective punishment and sort of, and punishing someone for the sins of their forefathers. I mean, I'm sure everybody would agree on a basic moral level that that's not what should be done. But then there are a lot of, and you're of course aware of these objections to your critique, and we can start with the first one, which is that you're taking this out of context, and this is not only applied to the Bible but even to the other holy books that I am minimally familiar with, the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita, but here we are of course discussing the Bible. So what would you say to that? I mean, that you're taking these verses out of context.
Well, I hear that a lot. If you would take them in context, you would see. And sometimes Christians will say, well, the real context is the whole moral arc of the story leading up to the death and resurrection of Jesus, because we needed to be guilty of our sins, but then Jesus would die for our sins. The whole idea of sacrificing and shedding blood of animals was so that Jesus would be the final sacrifice, and so on. So you hear that argument. If you look at the total context, you'll see that what God was doing, the genocide, was actually good for the planet. He was trying to clean out sin. But tell that to the parents of a 3-year-old who were in one of these Canaanite villages as these big, sweaty Israelite warriors come in, God's warriors come in, and they're about to chop off the head of that 3-year-old. Did the warrior turn to the parents and say, by the way, if you look at this in the moral context of the arc of 2,000 years until the birth of Jesus, this is actually a good, merciful thing I'm doing? Would that have made any difference to those people in that day who were suffering those consequences by God? So, yeah, you can go through the Bible. You can find a few verses that say God is good. Yeah. God takes care of us, right? You can find those, and those are what you hear from the pulpit. But you can also go through the Bible like I did and find over 1,500 examples of God not acting good, not acting well, acting in a horrible way. And so who's taking things out of context, right? Here you have a handful of verses that say this, but here you have dozens of verses that show this. So if you look at the context, and often in many of these verses I show, here's what was happening before that verse, after that verse, here's what the words meant when the people who wrote them. So it is a kind of a lame objection, but I meet that objection. Let me read a few more examples.
Sure.
I was surprised when I was doing this study that the God of the Bible actually not only commanded, but actually committed rape.
Wow.
Now that sounds kind of strong.
Yeah.
Because God is supposedly this physical, spiritual being,
Sure.
non-physical, so how can God rape women? But most theology says, well, God does his work through his instruments. So God punished the Israelites through the neighboring tribes when their armies would come in. Well, there's a verse in Jeremiah 13. Look at this verse. This is the context of this verse is that the Israelites are asking, why are we being punished? And God said, it's because you're disobeying me, and so I'm going to punish you with these armies. What happens when invading armies come into cities, right? What happens? There's not only killing and plundering, but there's also rape that happens in every arm. So look at this verse in Jeremiah 13. The Lord has spoken. It is for the greatness of your iniquity that your skirts are lifted up and you are violated.
Wow.
Some verses say raped, right? Mm-hmm. So God's saying because of your iniquity, that's why they're coming in here and you're being raped. Yeah. He goes on to say, because you have forgotten me and trusted in lies, I myself will lift up your skirts over your face and your shame will be seen. That's God talking. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if that was metaphorical, what a horrible thing to say. Yeah. You know, even if one of our elected politicians were to make a really crude sexist joke, threatening rape and saying, it's just metaphorical. I mean, that's just really a crass thing to say. But here the God of the Bible directly says, I myself, and I have other examples of the Bible of God doing it.
And you sort of preempted, Dan, my next question, which is the counter that religious folks would have for you, that it's not meant to be literal. It's meant to be metaphorical or even allegorical. And let me tell you the small tale about a person who I quite greatly admire, but I found his attempt at making the Bhagavad Gita allegorical to be lame, and that's Mahatma Gandhi. So the Gita is also very violent, and the way that Gandhi said it can be made sense of is as an allegorical tale about the battle between good and evil. Yeah. I suppose you could do that, but then you're pitching it at such an abstract level that it almost stops making sense. So for the Bible, what would be your response to that notion that it's not meant to be taken literally, it's meant to be taken at a different level?
Well, okay, you can say a couple of things about that. If it's not to be taken literally and it's just a metaphor, why that metaphor? I mean, why the ugly metaphor, right? Yeah. What we can say, even if it were metaphorical and totally fictional, we can then go into that mode and say, well, then in that fiction, that was a horrible thing to do, even if it wasn't true. But this verse is talking about an actual invasion, and most Christians believe that the Israelites were actually invaded by the Babylonians and others who were coming in to persecute and destroy as God's punishment. They don't think those battles were metaphorical. They think they were real battles. Yeah. And so another good problem, an objection to the metaphorical argument is to say, well, okay, so there's metaphor in the Bible. We all know that, right? Sure. When Jesus said, I am the door, we don't look for hinges and a doorknob. We know when he's called the Lamb of God, we don't shear off the wool. Yeah. We know there's figures of speech in the Bible, right? Yeah. So the problem is, where do you draw the line? I think it's kind of convenient that a lot of these Bible defenders are just sort of pulling this defense out of their back pocket, basically, to say, so well, I don't like this verse, so that's metaphorical. But I do like this verse, so it isn't. Yeah. So why are they drawing the line there? If you can draw the line there, why not draw it all the way to the top and say that not only is the prodigal son a parable, and not only are Adam and Eve a metaphor, but what other characters, like God himself, maybe Yahweh himself is just a big metaphor. And the whole thing could be just one huge figure of speech that we're not meant to take literally. And it's just the way that the ancient Israelites made sense of their lives at the time. Yeah. So
that's a great answer. Another response or objection, Dan, that more pious folks would have to your book is that it's a matter of interpretation. And of course, tomes and tomes have been written trying to interpret the Bible, give it a gentle face. What would be your counter to that?
Well, yeah, of course, it is a matter of interpretation, and you can see that when you look at the different translations. In my book, I used about 13 different English translations of the Bible. And you can see the King James and the Reims Douay and the New International Version and the American Standard. You can look at all these English translations, and you can see differences in the words. For example, in Isaiah 7:14, where God said, I created evil, the word evil is ra, which is the Hebrew word for evil. The same word in the Garden of Eden, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, ra, which is obviously moral evil. But some translations don't say evil there. Some of them say trouble or calamity. I create peace and I create calamity. Well, what difference does it make? God's creating some kind of a mess, whether you call it evil or calamity. You can interpret these verses a lot of different ways. Either way you interpret these verses, he doesn't come off very well. If you're thinking about metaphysical, cosmic evil with a capital E, which I don't think the ancient Israelites even had that concept. So the word ra in most of their usage meant horrible, moral evil, physical things happening to people in the real world, which is how you and I would categorize evil. So yeah, there's interpretations there, and you don't have to be an expert to notice that the experts all disagree with each other. So whose interpretation? You tend to cherry pick what you want to make your version of God be the best possible version. Shall we keep going through here some more?
Certainly, Dan.
Racist. Richard Dawkins says God is racist, right? Here's a couple of verses. In Deuteronomy, the Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So the Israelites were chosen above everybody else. They were put higher. That's racism, basically. There's other verses there. In Deuteronomy 7:3 says, do not intermarry with those other people. What if that happened in this country? What if we said, well, Christians don't ever intermarry with Buddhists or Hindus or with, or I would say as an evangelical, don't intermarry with a Catholic, right? So I mean, that is a racism. It's the whole group of people. And racism isn't necessarily just skin color or ethnicity. Racism can be, a group of people within a group, that you are.
But talking of racism, Dan, didn't the race-based insinuations in the Bible have real life and real world consequences because they were used to justify slavery, segregation? Didn't they quote the Bible very often? And can you talk just a bit about that?
Well, that's one of the new ones that I added to Dawkins' list was slave monger. We're not going to go into that today, but the Bible is really a slave manual. And so one group of people was considered superior to another. And in the Bible, you see the Israelites were considered superior. There's a story in the 25th chapter of Numbers that I talk about in my book. It's about a high priest named Phinehas. And Phinehas was the grandson of the high priest Aaron, who was the big. Aaron and Moses were the big leaders who got the message directly from God. And Phinehas was a righteous grandson. He was a priest also. And so God had told the Israelites, don't intermarry with the Midianites. The Midianites are bad. Actually, the Midianites were also descended from Abraham. So they were kind of like kissing cousins. They were just kind of south of the Israelites. And God said, don't intermarry with them. They're bad. You know why they were bad? They worshiped the wrong God. They worshiped this god Baal Peor.
Makes a lot of sense.
And so don't intermarry with them at all. And if you do, these plagues will come. And so what happens with kissing cousins? I mean, obviously, there's going to be some intercourse in all senses of that word from groups to group. Why not? The West Side Story, the whole idea of Romeo and Juliet, this whole idea that there's us versus them, there's our group, don't touch them. And so these plagues were happening, and in spite of all that, all of the death and all of the threats, God saying, you Israelites don't marry, there was an Israelite man who then took a Midianite woman into his tent. The idea was that they got married. They were going to start a family. Cosbi and Zimri were their names. We know that in Numbers 25. And so Phinehas got so angry that this man broke God's law and intermarried with somebody who was outside the Israelite race. He took a sword in his hand. And let me read what it says here. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he got up and left the congregation. Taking a spear in his hand, he went after the Israelite man into the tent and pierced the two of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly, and they died.
Yeah.
So what if somebody were to do that today? What if some righteous evangelical, preacher were to see a Christian marrying a Buddhist, let's say, or marrying a Canadian Hindu?
Yeah.
It was a mixed, you're not supposed to mix with them. What if that preacher then took a gun or a sword and went in and killed both of them? What would happen?
Obviously, he would be held accountable and imprisoned and sentenced and imprisoned.
Yeah, it would be a hate crime,
yes,
really,
absolutely.
of the highest degree.
Absolutely.
But you know what happened to Phinehas? He was rewarded.
Wow.
God said, you are rewarded for your zeal in keeping the race pure, in obeying my orders. So Phinehas was rewarded with a perpetual priesthood unto all of his descendants. So that's the kind of morality we find in the Bible. Bloody racism, a bloody guarding of God's people. It's kind of like a jealous, possessive husband who says to his wife, honey, I really love you, you'll be my wife, but if you ever look sideways at another man, I'm going to tear your eyes out, and I'm going to burn your hair, and I'm going to spread cow poop on your face, and I'm not making this up. It's in the Bible. That's what God says to the Israelites, all these things that he's going to do to them. And so this not intermarrying and not mixing, having a pure race, not mixing with the impure people of other groups, that's all in the Bible. Then, I think one of the most damning verses in the whole Bible is about the story of Job. And it's in the chapter Capriciously Malevolent. That's one of Dawkins' lines, capriciously malevolent. You know the story of Job where Satan went up to God and said, hey, Job is a good man. He's blameless, and he obeys you, and he's got a wife and 10 children and cattle, and he's prosperous and all that. And Satan said to God, I bet if you took away your protection, you built a hedge around him. If you took away the protection, I bet you he would not. And look at Job chapter 2, verse 3. God answered, the Lord said to Satan, this was after he tortured Job. He tortured him, right? And killed his 10 kids. Have you considered my servant Job? You incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. God admits he had no reason. He did this.
Yeah.
And he's making a point of that because he said Job's a good man. There was no reason. And yet he allowed Satan to prompt him to destroy the man and kill his 10 children. And Satan did it with God's blessing, obviously. In fact, you know how many people Satan is credited with killing in the whole Bible? Do you know?
Tell me, Dan.
10. Those were the 10.
Okay.
That's it.
Job's family.
In the whole Bible, that's the only place where you see God killing people.
Well, here I have a small personal tale to add. As a 5th grader, we were learning figures of speech in English, and as patient as Job came up, and we had a Christian teacher, Mr. Gordon, and he told us the whole story about Job, and even at that age, it didn't make any sense to me at all. And so as I'm surprised as adults, the whole notion of Job being so horribly punished can make any sense to anyone whatsoever.
Did you pronounce it Job or Job or what?
Yeah, he told us how it was pronounced.
How to pronounce it,
exactly,
the story.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if you read the book of Job, there is no moral tale there.
Yeah.
The only answer in the book of Job, and there's been volumes written about Job, the only answer is that there's no answer. God is powerful. He can do what he wants. Yeah. And towards the end, Job's wife came up to him and said, why don't you just give up and curse God? Look what he's doing to you. He's making you sick. He's killed all your children. He's killed all your livestock. Yeah. He's taken away everything. You've got these boils, and he's sitting in this pile of ashes. But through all of that, Job did not sin with his lips.
Yeah.
And he said, if we're going to receive good from God, shouldn't we also receive evil?
Yeah.
And there you go. Job even admitted. In the book of Job, you'll see that word evil. God did this evil to Job. God, and even Job's friends in the very last chapter said, we lament all of the evil that God did to you. So the God of the Bible is an evil God.
So now, Dan, we go from the micro level, the family of Job, to the macro level, which is genocide. And I hope not too many believing people make this defense, but some may say that if God's committing genocide, like against the Canaanites, maybe they deserved it. Maybe they did enough evil to deserve such a fate.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Well, you hear that all the time, right? on the one hand, you hear people like William Lane Craig saying, we're not supposed to judge God morally. He's not under the same moral constraints that we are. Therefore, God can do what God gives life, God can take life.
Yeah.
And yet then, as you just pointed out, they do go ahead and judge God by saying, well, he had a reason.
Yeah.
Why does God need a reason? If God had a reason, we could appeal to the same reason ourselves. And yet they say, well, the Canaanites were so bad. Historically, yeah, some of the Canaanite people were bad. There was some child sacrifice. There was some stuff going on, just like in many cultures, like in the Mayans and other cultures. Sure. But the Israelites were no better. If you look at the Israelites themselves, they practiced child sacrifice. You know the story of Abraham and Isaac. They didn't go through with it, but Jephthah did. Yeah. I have a whole passage about Jephthah who sacrificed his daughter. He burned his daughter alive as a fulfilling a vow to God. So it wasn't that the Canaanites were so horribly evil that they had to be destroyed. You sometimes hear that, well, God has this God's eye view of the world, and he knows that sometimes, sometimes you have to amputate a limb to save a life. You have to do some horrible thing, and we would agree. Yeah. Once in a while, we might have to do some really bad things in order for a greater good.
Sure.
But the parents, you can at least explain why it has to be done. If God can't explain why it has to be done, then it's just a who cares why. God does it.
It's capricious.
And besides that, what difference did it make to those people in those days, those Canaanites, who were living their lives just like almost anybody else around the world? Some of them were horrible, some of them were good. Yeah. And of course, the Israelites even offered up their children to pass through the fire. Yeah. They were doing the same thing. So that's sort of another back pocket defense that they bring up, that God, even if God has a higher moral example, you and I, with moral judgment, can look at that God and we can say, wait a minute, my boss, my dad, my president, my king did wrong. Just because you're the boss doesn't mean you're above criticism. Talking about bully, he's this malevolent bully. There's a story in the 16th chapter of the book of Numbers about a man named Korah, K-O-R-A-H.
Okay, yes.
So Moses and Aaron were getting these words from God, and then they would proclaim to all the people, the 12 tribes of Israel, here's what God says. And then they would go back into the tabernacle or on the mountain and come back down, here's what God says in the 10 Commandments and all these rules. And so there was a group of people, Korah was their leader. They were Levites. They were from the priestly tribe. They were saying very much what modern Protestants were saying to the Vatican, to the Pope. Wait a minute, why do we need you to tell us what God says? Why doesn't God talk straight to us? Which is kind of sensible. That's the whole Protestant Reformation, was that, in fact, a lot of Baptists have this doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. You don't need some intermediary, some pope, some priest to tell you what God says. So Korah went to Moses and said, hey, Moses, I got a question here. He wasn't defying Moses. He wasn't being rebellious. He just had a question. And he said, why is it that God only talks through you guys to us? Why can't God talk to us, the people?
That's a great question. Yeah,
it is a good question. And he wasn't being like maybe disrespectful. I mean, wouldn't any Christian want to ask the authority of any pastor or anybody? I mean, wouldn't you want to kind of know, why do you have the right and the authority to speak to us like that? And you know what happened in the book of Numbers 16? When Korah, what do you think Moses would have done at that question?
I mean, knowing the way the Bible is, I can only guess it would have been not a very pleasant fate for him.
Well, I think we have a picture, don't we, Bruce? Moses got so angry at that question that he said, Korah, you are an evil man. And he had the earth open up, and Korah and all of his followers fell down into the earth. They went all the way down to the pit, to the hell, the bottom. And then the earth closed back up on them again and killed them all. And then Moses said, that'll show you. You don't ever question my authority.
That's a gaudy fate for asking a question.
It's a pretty surgical airstrike, too, when you think about it. Totally. Here's all these, God was able to go right there. Those people fell right in. Yeah. If you made a movie of that, you'd need really amazing special effects.
Very good special effects, yes.
That would be something. But anyway, the whole point, that story didn't happen. We know that story did not happen. That's a myth. But the story was told to the Israelites to frighten them. Yes. You don't question authority. You don't question God's leader. So that's bullying. That's using physical harm to bully the people to obey you. Another thing I was surprised about is that the God of the Bible is actually aborticidal. You know, a lot of right-wing Christians today who are anti-choice and anti-abortion, they think God is pro-life. That's the opposite in the Bible. There are verses where God himself actually commanded and committed and threatened abortion. Look at this verse in Hosea, where God is talking about why the Israelites are being punished. God said, because she has rebelled against her God, their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. What do you call that? When you have a pregnant woman and you rip her open, what do you call that? That's aborticide.
Yeah.
That's God himself speaking.
That sounds so gruesome, yeah.
And it's not just that he's saying, well, this is just a consequence because you're bad. It's him making the threat to the Israelites, because you didn't obey me.
Yeah.
Be like the abusive husband telling his wife, you know, here's what I'm going to do to you if you don't love me. If you look at some other guy, this is what's going to happen to you. There's another one in the book of Numbers where there's a whole long passage, but right in the middle of this big anti-life. God is not pro-life in the Bible. God says, may the Lord cause you to become a curse among your people when he makes your womb miscarry. God is making these women miscarry.
Thing to say to anybody. Yeah.
I mean, it's ugly, you know, and you hear about all these people talking about how God is just pro-life and he's good and he's wonderful. And you find gruesome verses. This is just a tip of the iceberg. There's horrible, gruesome verses.
And talking of the tip of the iceberg, Dan, we can go on forever, but what would be some other choice examples that you would give maybe in some other categories?
Well, you know what? You don't have to buy the book to get it. We actually made, let me grab this laptop here. We actually made a website where you can get all these verses for free. It's called The Unpleasant Companion.
Dan, you should be encouraging people to buy the book.
Well, yes, of course you should buy the book, obviously. But if you don't, if you just want the verses without the context,
certainly, yes, and that we have up on our website.
In my book, I give the context and the words, but if you just want a list of verses, here you can go to this website. It's called unpleasantgod.ffrf.org, and we call it The Unpleasant Companion. There's Richard Dawkins, and over here to the right, you can see his famous sentence, the God of the Old Testament, and you can click on any one of these, like if you want to click on the word jealous, well, here comes up all the verses for jealous. You can see a jealous and avenging God is Lord. Here's all these verses where God says, I am jealous, and the God of the Bible is jealous. You can click on any one of these others, like capriciously malevolent, and there you see Job, and more than just those verses that I gave. You can see all these other things where God is capriciously malevolent to people. You can see also the additional 8 that I, down in the bottom left here. There's 8 additional ones, like pyromaniacal. You can see pyromaniacal, all this fire and burning and flames and punishment by burning and cities burned. You can just quote all these verses, and if you want to, you can share them. You can share it on Twitter or on Facebook. If there's one of these verses you want to show to one of your friends that you're arguing with, well, look at what it says here.
No, I found it extremely educational, especially since I'm of a non-Christian background. But regardless of whether you're from a Christian or a non-Christian background, the verses that are cited on that webpage are extremely eye-opening.
So you can use them. And since that time, I've added 2 more. I added homicidal, but I've also added, here's homicidal, the killing of humans that God threatened and that God did himself. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children, and so on. But just in the last week or so, I added, down on the bottom here, there's no images yet, but I added evil and terrorist. There's many places where the God of the Bible describes his own actions as evil, using the word evil. And you can just read through all of these.
That's very self-indicting.
For example, Jeremiah, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will bring evil upon this place. And evil from God fell upon the cities, and so on. And there's a couple dozen verses where God himself uses the word evil to describe his own actions. And yet, if you can find 2 or 3 verses that say God is good, that's supposed to erase all of that. And there's also then, you can also go to the very bottom and see terrorist. And I was surprised about this, but the word terror, the terror of God and the terrorism of God, shows up all through the Bible. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. I will make thee a terror. There shall be great terror, for the God is with the company of the righteous, and on and on. Here's a few dozen verses of terror. And if we put those together, we can say, according to the Bible itself, God is an evil terrorist. So go to that page, share it with your friends, and then, you know, on the front page, of course, it talks about the book, the most unpleasant character in all fiction, which you can read for a broader picture of that. But there's one more question that Christians raise. Can you think of that?
No, Dan, enlighten me.
Well, Christians will often say, well, that was the Old Testament.
Of course. And that's been a standard defense. Even I know that, Dan, being of non-Christian background, since forever, that the Old Testament is problematic maybe, violent maybe, but we believe so much more in the New Testament, and the New Testament basically gets precedence over the Old Testament, and Jesus is such a peaceful figure. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, do you have that slide up there, Bruce? Here's Jesus himself, where he says, and look, Jesus was not always a peaceful man. He was violent and he was angry in the Bible a lot of times, just like his Father. Jesus said, I and the Father are one, in John. Later in that same chapter, Jesus said, the Father is in me and I am in the Father.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say later in the book, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus never criticized the God of the Old Testament. He praised him, and whenever Jesus quoted Scripture, he quoted those violent verses from the Old Testament. If the New Testament really were a new corner of this moral arc that's being turned, we're getting rid of the bad old days. If the New Testament were really like that, what Jesus should have said was, I apologize for my dad.
Yes.
He was a violent, sexist, homophobic bully. I'm sorry. There's a better way. And the New Testament is obviously less violent.
Yeah.
And we see in the New Testament a different use of the word evil from in the Old Testament. So we do see some changes. They were living in a different time. And we do see a little bit more words about peace and love in the New Testament. But all in all, Jesus never denounced his Father. And in fact, he based his whole life upon that Old Testament God. And he says, I and the Father are one. So he wasn't really turning a corner. He was building on this without denouncing it. So I think it's a bit disingenuous for people to say, well, Jesus changed it all, when actually he did not. He never said such a thing. And Jesus was pyromaniacal. He threatened the lake of fire and punishing. Jesus said you should gouge out your eyes. Jesus threatened punishment through hell. Jesus showed us how compassionate he was by saying in the book of Luke that there are some slaves that you have that you should not beat as hard as the other slaves that you have, because they didn't know better.
Sure.
Why didn't Jesus denounce slavery?
Yeah.
Why didn't he say owning and controlling and beating human beings is bad? He didn't. He never once did that. He never said a thing about abortion or a woman's dealing with an unwanted pregnancy or any of that. He was basically a chip off the old block. He wasn't just a chip off the old block. He said he was the old block himself. So,
yeah, Dan, and to supplement what you're saying, a scholar, Philip Jenkins, has an entire book on this, critiquing the notion that the New Testament supplants the Old Testament and makes it obsolete. He says that's not true at all.
yeah. So it's a continuation, and it's a different book, and you will find some things. The word evil in the New Testament often refers to the evil one. You don't see that in the Old Testament. As a nominative noun, presumably the evil one was Satan. So you'll see a switch in some of the theology within Christianity, but and you also see a little more connection of the words evil and wicked dealing with human moral behavior, whereas in the Old Testament it's mostly evil and wicked. Mostly the word evil deals with God's behavior. So we can talk forever and ever about all this if you want. But I think we have some questions. Did you want to say something else?
No, Dan, I mean, or people could read your book and delve deeply into it.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks. So do we have questions? All right, we do. Okay, so Lindsay S. says, if God killed, and the word killed's in quotes, if God killed all of humanity and the animals for being sinful during the flood, why the heck did he give humans free will in the first place? Isn't that just setting up humanity for failure? Also, I guess sea creatures weren't sinful enough. They would have been fine during the flood.
Well, the first, Dan, Lindsay may know that you've written a book on the notion of free will also. So could you answer that? There's nobody better to answer that notion of God and free will, and I suppose the flood than you.
Yeah, well, the question of whether humans have free will is an open question. Yeah, I do have a book called Free Will Explained. Came out last year. Came out this year. And the big question in that book, of course, isn't so much whether humans have free will or not. We all assume we do, even though we don't, you know, because of determinism. But the question is, does God have free will? Because whether you think we have free will or not, free will requires an ignorance of the future. If you know your future choices, well, then you don't have free will, right? So if God is omniscient and omnipotent and a personal being, and he knows his future decisions, then he can't have free will.
Yeah.
If you know the future, you can't have free will.
Sure.
But yeah, so think about Adam and Eve in the garden. God created these people, and it's presumably a perfect God can only create perfect things, right? But then Eve and Adam sinned. They took a bite of that fruit, and they did something wrong, and therefore the rest of us have inherited that sin.
Yes.
That's a good question. Is sin genetic? I mean, if it comes from those two people down to us, there must be some gene, some sin gene, or who knows, original sin. So the question then, of course, is why did Eve sin? If Eve was created perfect, why did she sin? And they always say, well, she had free will.
Conundrum, yeah.
She had free will, right? Yeah. God gave her free will. But even if that's true, even if Eve and Adam did have free will, they could have chosen good.
Yeah.
Why did they exercise their free will not to choose good? Yeah. Why did they exercise it to choose bad? There must have been some flaw in them to start with. If there was a flaw in them, who created that flaw? Right? So there's a paradox there.
Yeah.
So if God created Adam and Eve did something wrong, who's responsible for that? Because they didn't create themselves. Yeah. They didn't create that flaw within themselves that would cause them to disobey God. So however you look at it, she's right. It was a big setup to be it. And of course the sea creatures.
Yeah, I'd never thought of that, Dan. What about all those fishes and mollusks and lobsters and oysters and all of those creatures?
It was just the fresh water and the living. And I wonder if it's possible for a bird to have floated long enough. I think birds could sit on the water. What about ducks?
Yes.
I mean, but it's a silly question because it didn't happen. But and then think about how many cultures actually did have some kind of watercraft.
Yes.
Canoes or whatever. I mean, some of them.
The Phoenicians, for example.
Some of them could have survived for that long. I mean, it's possible. Anyway, it's kind of a silly story. But in any event, the whole point of the flood was genocide.
Yeah.
God wanted to kill every living thing. And in the Bible, he did. And it was just those people on that one boat. By the way, the Bible doesn't call it a boat. It was not a boat. An ark is a box.
Yeah.
Like the Ark of the Covenant was a box.
Yeah.
Those desert people didn't even have an idea of a navigable craft. They just thought about this flat box like a raft with walls kind of thing that would just lift up and then basically come back down again.
Sure.
So when you see all these pictures of Noah's Ark, looks like a boat or a craft, that's not what the Bible says it was. It was just this big rectangular thing which would not have worked.
Yeah.
Especially in the biggest storm in all of history, it would have just toppled in any event. So another question here. We're almost out of time, aren't we? Nick Roberts.
Sure.
If the Old Testament doesn't count, why do Christians keep putting up the Ten Commandment monuments on public property?
That's a great question, Dan, and something we have wrestled with here in the office too.
Yeah, because you'll hear them say that.
Yes.
Well, that was the Old Testament. Jesus is the New.
Yeah.
So we need to look at the Old Testament with a grain of salt, or we need to put it in historical context, and we don't live by the Old Testament anymore. And Pat, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Then if that is true, why are you still quoting the 23rd Psalm?
Sure.
Why are you still putting the Old Testament laws in front of the city hall or in front of schools and that? So they should be consistent. They pick and choose.
Yeah.
Why not put some of these aborticide verses up? Why not put some of these genocide verses up? Why not put some of these ugly things that the rape verse? Why not put that in every school and let the children read about the God of the Bible? Why are they cherry picking? Shall we go on here?
Absolutely, Dan.
All right, so Kinsey, last question. Okay, guess we are all out of time. Kinsey Wilson. Since God wanted humanity not to have any other gods before me, that's the first commandment,
Yeah.
and a whole bunch of other rules to live by, wouldn't he have put the prophets in other places besides the Middle East? People in the Americas
Yeah.
could not have known about this particular God for the longest time, or known that their behavior was considered
absolutely.
sinful.
Yeah. Or sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many places that were so remote. Australia.
Yeah. Why not?
Exactly.
Why not have those prophets? Why not? Why? Well, because God is racist. We already know that. God picks one group of people to
Sure.
be His special treasured group. But the question goes on: are those people who could have never known about the God of the Bible in hell by default? And in Sunday school, I remember thinking about that. And if there's a verse in the New Testament that says that if they have heard the gospel, then they're going to go to hell. So then, wouldn't it be better not to send missionaries?
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't send the missionaries so that they can die without having heard and made a choice. I'm an enrolled member of an American Indian tribe, the Lenape tribe, the Delaware Indians, who were on this continent, who knows, our ancestors way back 12, 15,000 years ago, which, by the way, was 6,000 years before the earth was created, if you follow. So all those millennia of human beings raising their families, falling in love, growing their crops, hunting, building their homes, making the clothing, and singing their songs and telling, all those generations, they didn't know how to be good to each other. They didn't know how to be kind and moral and empathetic and altruistic. And they fought their wars like everybody did too. But the human values they had, were they so stupid that it would not have dawned on them that there's something wrong with killing without the Ten Commandments, without somehow this Middle Eastern tribe saying, we now have the copyright to these list of rules that now the whole world needs to live by? And that is a good question. And it kind of puts the light of the idea that God cared about the human race when He waited until just the last few seconds of our history, really, to bring His gospel.
Well, there's so much to talk about, Dan, but we're running out of time, aren't we? Yeah.
We could do 10 shows on this.
Absolutely.
We could do a whole show about the angry or about cannibalistic.
Yeah.
Look it up. The God of the Bible is cannibalistic too. So
Well, there's so much material, Dan, that of course you wrote a book that consists of hundreds of pages. So there's a lot to talk about here and a lot to discuss. And there's so many categories. I mean, and you added some of your own to what Dawkins had to say. But it's been a great discussion. And thanks so much, Dan.
Well, thank you. Well, that's our show for today. And we want to thank everybody who works on this show. Bruce Johnson in the control room, and Lauren doing the computer stuff, and Chris Lyons on one of the cameras. Hi, Chris. What else is Lauren doing? Oh, and Buzz. Buzz Kemper's doing sound. Hi, Buzz. He also does the sound for Free Thought Radio. And Bailey, our communications, what are you called, Bailey?
Editorial assistant.
Oh, editorial assistant. Okay, she's brand new here, doing one of the cameras. And thank you also for watching the show. And don't forget, our convention is coming up in San Francisco. It's less than a month away now, November 2 through 4. Speakers include Salman Rushdie, the former director of Planned Parenthood, Cecile Richards, Adam Savage of Mythbusters, the actor John Delancey, he's one of the actors in Star Trek, then Sarah Hayder of Ex-Muslims of North America, the Leanne Lord, the award-winning stand-up comedian, and another irreverent comic actress, the Saturday Night Live alum, Julia Sweeney, there on the right.
And also appearing at the convention will be Insaf Haidar, the activist wife of a Saudi freethinker, Raif Badawi, who's actually been flogged by the Saudi government and whose persecution and imprisonment have caused global outrage. The Saudi government has been in the news just recently for actually disappearing and allegedly murdering a dissident who visited their consulate in Turkey, in Istanbul. So both Insaf and Raif Badawi are really courageous. Insaf lives in Canada and will be gracing our, so to speak, our convention in San Francisco. So you can register online today at ffrf.org/outreach/convention.
And if you want to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone, you can send the text FFRF to 52886. and some data rates might apply. So we'll see you again next week for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.
Thank you so much, Dan.